Hello and welcome, I'm Oleksii Kuropiatnyk and you're watching Head to Head with UATV. Today the whole world commemorates victims of the 9/11 tragedy, the single deadliest terrorist attacks in human history. 18 years ago, an extremist group from al-Qaeda hijacked 4 passenger planes. 2 of them flew into the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center in New York City. This led to the 2 gigantic 110-story buildings collapse and kill thousands of people. A 3rd plane was crashed into the Pentagon, and the 4th plane was initially flown towards Washington D.C. but crashed into a field in Pennsylvania after its passengers stood in the way of the hijackers. As the world learned the lessons of this tragedy, it seems the horrific events of 9/11 continue to shape the world we live in. To discuss this, we welcome to our studio today Oleksii Kuropiatnyk, foreign policy and security expert at the Maidan of Foreign Affairs. From 2001 until 2005, Mr. Kuropiatnyk served as the first secretary and policy advisor of the Embassy of Ukraine to the United States in Washington, D.C. Hello and thank you for joining us, Mr. Kuropiatnyk.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too. So 9/11 experts say had changed the perception of terrorism from referred to as some local rare occurrences to global phenomena and challenge. As I said in the introduction, you used to work in the Ukrainian embassy to the United States. What do you remember about these tragic events?
As a member of the embassy personnel, we remember that it was Tuesday, and really it was a kind of a shock to all of us, for it was approximately around 10 on Washington mid-time in the morning. And at that time we had a delegation which was working on the Great Mall around the Ministry of Energy and Ministry of Agriculture. They're located right in the center of Washington D.C. and we were really disturbed, for there was a blast previously in the center of Washington, which later has disappeared from the current news, but we remember about the blast into the building of Pentagon.
Right.
And just in a couple of hours, even earlier, we've seen on TV stream the collapse of World Trade Center in New York City, which was not far from our. Not far. There was a meeting of one of our diplomats around that building, so we were all disturbed about his safety.
How did it result onto domestic safety measures in the United States? I remember the United States closed borders for certain days, closed the airspace, so basically all the flights were cancelled. What do you remember? Maybe there were some safety measures taken in the embassies in Washington, D.C. because one of the planes was heading to Washington.
I can point out two things. First of all, the perimeter and checkpoints around the building of National Security Council, which is merging with the building of the White House. The security measures dramatically changed. Some areas were closed and unavailable still at the time. And that made some complication for our diplomatic staff to communicate we had to communicate more difficult from the standpoint of checking procedures coming to the National Security Council. And secondly, we all felt at that time that the security procedures in the airport, first of all, Dallas International Airport, changed dramatically. And that just evoked kind of very negative reaction from our high officials, which had to put to flash their credentials and to put out their boots, their belt, and we've seen all that some of our ministers appreciated that as a kind of insult.
So they were insulted
and
by...
that made the whole atmosphere of doing business with regular meetings and delegations coming up to Washington D.C. more difficult and nervous to the staff.
Very tense. How long did this atmosphere last for?
Around a couple of years. But we've seen that gradually the procedures became more rational, more smooth, and still we had that they were still in place, some clue elements, until my departure in 2005.
You mentioned that it was harder to do business talks in such an atmosphere, and if we remember the bilateral relations between Ukraine and the United States, at that time they were not perfect, they were tense. Could you please tell us how did this terrorist act, or did it actually result anyhow on the relations between the two countries?
You are absolutely correct. At that time we had very tough relationship concerning our bilateral relations between Ukraine and Iraq. And American side always tried to rebuke us that we were trying to export to that country some military equipment, logistical military equipment, from pontoon bridges to cross the rivers during flows, and some others. Later we've seen the Kalchuga scandal. There were allegations that Ukraine exported Kalchuga radar system, but that was a fake news. That all made the whole atmosphere full of suspicions and unbased allegations. But they were generated not in the Pentagon, as they cleared out. It was all done in
the White House?
No, in the State Department.
In the State Department. So how
they were generating that wave of animosity, that wave of suspicion, and I remember that it was a very unique time when our President Kuchma, it was his second half of his second tenure, he didn't have a single opportunity to visit Washington D.C. with a diplomatic visit on the highest level. It was very strange, despite the fact that after 2003, Ukraine engaged in multinational efforts to bring Iraq under control in Al-Qaeda, and we had a military detachment there. No way, nothing happened.
But after this attack, did Ukraine try to soften somehow the relations with the United States, somehow to navigate them into some prosperous direction?
The whole lot of things were done by the diplomatic staff on the highest level, on the operational level, on my level, in order to clarify and somehow use the avenues, different kinds of avenues in politics, in security, on security issues, in economics, to repair the damage which was brought with these suspicions and
by these false accusations.
False accusations.
If we remember, back then the United States and former President George Bush launched a war against terrorism globally and invaded Afghanistan to displace the Taliban, who were hiding al-Qaeda officials. And since that time, many countries have strengthened their anti-terrorism legislation and also capabilities of expanded powers of law enforcement and intelligence services to prevent such attacks. Was Ukraine one among these countries, or did we wait until 2014 when our war started?
No, we waited until 2003 when Tuzla issue started in the fall of that year. The point is that it was in 2003, in February, when some prominent world players like France, for example, introduced during the United Nations session serious concerns and disbelief in the arguments which were produced by Mr. Colin Powell, that head of the State Department. Mr. Powell produced during the session in the United Nations 97 facts with slides trying to persuade the audience that Iraq was violating his obligations in terms of nuclear and chemical weapons of mass destruction.
Yeah, nuclear
Not
weapons.
a single fact was proved after the occupation. And France, knowing about that, voted against. And that was very symbolic at that time, before the operation on occupation in Iraq began.
So then how did Ukraine strengthen the anti-terrorism legislation? Did this result into Ukraine acting in this direction anyhow?
Ukraine produced a military assistance to control one of the provinces to the south of Baghdad in Al-Qaeda.
Mm-hmm.
And that was really a huge help, aid to the American efforts, as far as America was lacking full support of full international support. It was only Brits who supported unanimously in their parliament. France declined. Germany was very hesitating, trying to curb its participation only in Afghanistan. And many other European countries were very in two minds, thinking how to react to this and whether not to assist the United States. The point was that it was the first incident when Article 5 of NATO Charter was put into force.
Article 5, could you please remind us?
Article 5 speaks that when one of the members of the NATO is under attack, all the alliance is to defend it as itself.
To defend this state. Well, if we remember May 2011, U.S. Special Forces discovered and killed Osama bin Laden, the leader of al-Qaeda. They found him in Afghanistan. So the extremist group lost its leader, but did it make the world anyhow safer, in your opinion? Speaking about nowadays reality, speaking about the reality of 2011.
First of all, I would like to point out that from the very beginning, the United States Congress revealed some doubts about the real grounds to enact the Patriotic Act, which was immediately enacted after the 9/11 action in the fall of 2001. That Patriotic Act seriously curbed freedoms and liberties of the American citizens. Mm-hmm. And what is interesting, the investigation which was launched by the Congress never found neither proof nor disproof of those allegations. It's the first thing. And as for the Osama bin Laden, we see that it took more than a decade for law enforcement agencies of America to find and catch him. But what is interesting, he was never brought to the justice. He was never brought to the court, and his allegations were never proved in the court. He was simply killed. Mm-hmm. So we never know whether these allegations were true or not.
What do you personally think?
Well, I would like to keep my opinion to me.
Okay.
At least I am in doubts, but I can't take neither side as far as I lack serious proofs.
Well, right now we see that humanity entered this dangerous era of struggle for power and faith. Let's hope that world leaders will keep a constructive dialogue and will prevent all such atrocities and tragedies from recurrence. Thank you so much for your comments, and thank you for being a guest today in the studio.
You're welcome.
That was Oleksii Kuropiatnyk, foreign policy and security expert at the Maidan of Foreign Affairs. Thank you for watching Head to Head, and stay tuned for more with UATV.